hello, I'm Brian. This is Shelley. And we're back to our podcast in Acts.
It's a study in Acts.
A study in Acts. But it's a podcast.
It is.
In Acts.
Okay, so we are starting chapter 18. Last week we wrapped up
Athens.
And
17.
And if you didn't watch that podcast, go back and do it. More importantly, read Athens, because it is actually a really interesting section of Acts with a lot of really good stuff and one of Brian's favorite parts of the Bible. Mm-hmm. And so, but today, Paul is in Corinth. And
yes. Corinth
is a crazy place.
So if you don't have a map, bust out a map in front of you, or Google it, or some of them have it in the back of your Bible. Corinth is a little bit south and west of Athens, more down towards the end of of Greece.
Yeah, we're in Greece, and it is a bustling, busy seaport town. It has 2 harbors. Something I thought was interesting was that was a very excited, But anyway, so when Paul gets to Corinth, it's already an ancient city.
Yes.
Now we think of Corinth as an ancient city, but there's a lot of ancient cities in Greece. But I thought it was interesting that it's already ancient by the time he gets there. But it's also brand new. Yeah, because it got crushed.
Yeah, because the Romans when the Romans came in and overthrew the Greeks in the beginning of the Roman Empire, Corinth was one of the cities that was destroyed. So Augustus, you remember him from the census.
The world should be taxed.
All the world should be taxed. Guy at the birth of Jesus, Augustus had Corinth rebuilt.
Yeah.
And so, and it has 2 seaports, and it is built on the roads in Corinth are a plus. They're a cross. Mm-hmm. Because you've got Greece, you've got this little bitty strip of land, and then you've got that southern, it's almost an island down there. Mm-hmm. And Corinth was the spot in the middle. So you had sea traffic that went from one side of the ocean to the other, one side of that from the other, and then you had the road that took you down through the other direction, down into the southern tips of Greece.
So there was a lot of traffic, both boats and people, by foot, by road, that moved through Corinth, which made it it was an important spot for Paul to want to start a church, because if you had a thriving church in Corinth, it was going to be influencing the entire world, because people came through, they would stop, spend some time. In theory, they would get saved, get discipled some, and then move on, and they would take it everywhere. So if he could nail down Corinth, it was a major coup for Christianity. However, Corinth was a hotbed of sin and debauchery.
Yes.
It was like, so in classical Greek, to act like a Corinthian, you were fornicating. You were having sex. A lot of it, anywhere, anytime. And if you had a Corinthian companion, you had a prostitute. And so it was so well known for all of its debauchery.
I remember the 70s with the car that had rich Corinthian leather. And I don't know what that means.
I've forgotten about
now,
that.
Here's another really bizarre one. One of the roads that went through Corinth was a road for boats. Did you see that?
Yes.
And there was a spot there where they had like logs laid across the roads, so that instead of unloading a boat and reloading in a different boat, they actually would push on skids. They would push these boats, and there was a road that went through the middle of Corinth. There was a road for boats.
You know, they were inventive.
I've been in some unusual traffic jams in my life, but
never from a boat.
But I never had to stop and wait for a ship to cross.
Yeah, that was pretty funny. So Paul is in Corinth, and he meets a Jew named Aquila and his wife Priscilla, and they are key players moving forward.
Yes.
Because they were Jews who had gotten saved and knew what they were doing. It wasn't like they were Jews that had heard about the way, but they weren't really sure. They had actually learned, been discipled under someone, and they were excited to have Paul join them. And they were tent makers. So Paul was also a tent maker.
Yes.
Now, that does not mean that he made camping tents. It was... Tell him about the tent making.
Well, they're in Tarsus. Tarsus was, you remember?
Paul's from Tarsus.
Yeah. They were renowned for making a fabric that was a felt made out of goat hair. And it was renowned for making really good quality tents, awnings, covers, portable. In a temporary society, they would have had a lot of things. If you watch, how many, if you have kids, how many times did we all watch Aladdin? And there's all those tents and awnings and all of those things on the street to protect you from the sun. That was the kind of thing that they would have been making. They would have made it out of leather.
Yes.
Or out of, and I can't remember what the name of the fabric was, but it's a special fabric that Tarsus was renowned for its tents, because it did very well. It was a felted.
But it was also a process. It wasn't... So when I was growing up and they talk about Paul being the tent maker, I pictured Paul sitting with his little legs crossed, a needle and thread, sewing nylon fabric together to make a tent. But it wasn't. He actually knew the entire process of tent making. There is no spiritual significance to that whatsoever. It's just a fun fact to throw in.
Well, it is something, though, in some places Paul will talk about, that he mentions in places that he made tents, that he listed tent making. This is one of the places where he does that.
That is a skill that he has.
And that he did that so that he was not a burden on anyone that was, that as he went and preached and did all of these things, that he was able to care for himself in a lot of ways.
So let's address that a little bit, because it pops up. Brian and I are full-time ministry. And as missionaries, we lived in a country that we could not work in, so we had to raise support.
Could not work, not because we weren't able, but because the country... The nation wouldn't allow it.
Yeah, the way our visa was, if you were a minister, you could not make money. If you came as a business, it was a whole other visa system. America does the same thing. What visa you're there. We worked hard. Do not think that we were just laying around eating grapes and doing our nails for 12 years. But
grapes don't grow there.
No, they don't. But we could not take money from the country. So we had to raise funds. And we would run up against people all the time that said, well, you should find a business that will support you, because you should not, because Paul did tent making. He did make tents, and he did it to support himself at times. However, in this, and I'm glad we got to it, because when you look over on verse 5, it says, when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. What happened when they came from Macedonia? Well, let me tell you. They brought funds from Philippi. Remember last week I mentioned that the Philippian church sent funds to support the work that Paul was doing. Timothy brought funds from Philippi to Paul. When Paul had funds from Philippi, he stopped making tents and he went about ministering, because now he was free to do more ministry, which then increased his effectiveness as a minister. Not that he couldn't minister when he was making tents, not that you can't be bivocational, not that you should leave your job to minister. You can do both. And
Paul did.
And you can be a volunteer in your church and a checker at Safeway. It's not exclusive. But if you are in full-time ministry with a call, and you can somehow not have to be bivocational, And I have minister friends that if they hear this podcast, they will text me, hear my heart. Don't be lazy and don't steal from the body. But there is nothing wrong with paying your pastor, paying the people that work for your church. In fact, if you go over to 1 Corinthians 9, which, while Paul had left, and he wrote to the Corinthian church, and he says that he chose to not take funds from them, lest they accuse him of using them. So there will be times when you have to look at your audience also and what you are able to do. But Paul in 1 Corinthians 9 lays out a very detailed description of when and how to be supported by the people that you are ministering to, and that it is also okay to work.
We do see that throughout the book of Acts and in the Pauline epistles, the letters that Paul wrote, where there are times when he worked to support himself and to take care of his expenses. There were other times when he had support from some other source, so he didn't have to, so that he was able to more focus on, focus his time more directly on ministry. And he did a mix of both things depending on circumstance.
Well, in his time of tent making with Aquila and Priscilla, also forged a bond and a friendship with them that enhanced both of their ministries, because we're going to see as we move through Acts, Aquila and Priscilla become a very vital part of Paul's band of ministers. And that was forged right here. Working together and doing life together makes bonds and friendships. You're able to disciple. You can learn from one another. I'm pretty sure they helped him understand and assimilate into the Corinthian world, because a couple of the commentaries that I read, Paul was pretty shocked and appalled by what he saw. And that shows
Corinth was a unique place.
And it shows in his letters to them. And so I'm pretty sure Corinth wasn't a piece of cake for Paul. And so here he made friends that helped him with that.
You also find that, remember, as we've moved through the book of Acts, spoiler alert, Paul's going to end up in Rome. If you go the next book over, you're going to find out that Paul's going to write a letter to the Romans. He doesn't ever mention Rome or talking to Rome until he spends time with Priscilla and Aquila, who were from Rome.
Yes, they had been kicked
they
out.
weren't from there, but they were from there. That wasn't their. They were from somewhere else, but they had lived in Rome. And all of a sudden now, Paul, so while he's helping disciple and teach and talk with them, and they're, talking back and forth and all of those things, he's also picking up a real vision for the Romans. And that's probably where he's getting the information that he, when he writes the letter, the book of Romans, he's writing it to a group of people he's not yet met. And that knowledge probably came from Aquila and Priscilla.
Well, and it's even assumed that Romans 1:22 through 32, where Paul lists the debauchery, it is a mirror of Corinth. It is all the stuff that he lived and experienced and saw in Corinth, and he's warning, do not do this stuff.
Yes.
And so
well, one of the things I thought was interesting, one of the things I read said that there are places in the world today where prostitution, drugs, those kinds of things are legalized. There are places after that you can get to a place where it might become normal. In Corinth, all of those things were the things that good upstanding citizens did. That was the sending your kids to Sunday school equivalent in
it was a rough place.
It was a wild place.
If you could survive Corinth, you could survive anywhere.
Yeah, it was a wild place.
Yeah, and so he the the fact that he even established a church there is just kind of mind-blowing. But he did. They needed a lot of help, but he did it.
So Silas and Timothy catch up with him there.
Yeah.
Remember, he left them behind when he was making one of his hot exits out of town. And so he catches up. They catch up with him there. And he goes on and is still speaking in the synagogue and reaching out to the Jews.
Yes. And at this point, it says that he devoted himself exclusively to preaching and testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. But when they opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest. Some places it says he shook off the dust, similar to when he told his disciples to shake the dust off his...
Jesus did that?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Jesus told his disciples to shake off the dust when they'd been rejected and denied. And so here we see it's actually a Jewish thing to...
It's a cultural thing.
Get rid of every spot and wrinkle of that place. So he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent of it. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." That is a huge turning point for us today, because that was not that no one ever preaches to the Jews or has preached to the Jews since, but Paul turned his attention to what would have been classified as the pagans of the day.
Yeah. And, you see that now. Earlier, we saw where Peter began preaching to the Gentiles and that it was okay. And we followed that. If you missed that podcast, shoot back some episodes, you'll find it. But here, Paul does that. Up to this point, it keeps mentioning Gentiles, but it's Gentiles that are what they refer to as God-fearers.
It's like the Jews that were in the synagogue.
Yes.
Or not the Jews. There were Jews and
Greeks
in the
and
synagogue.
others.
The Greeks weren't Jews, but they were learning about God.
They were all following the same religious track. They were non-Jews that were pursuing the Jewish religion, if you want. And at this point, Paul finally says, okay, enough of that. And he rents a meeting hall next door to the synagogue. And
of course he did.
And begins having services next door where he's focusing on the people that aren't Jews, because the Jews don't listen.
It really does say, if you haven't read it, you should be reading this book, not just listening to us, because, well, we could lead you astray. We're not, but we could. But nonetheless, you should be getting some of your own revelation. But it really does say he went next door to the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. And then an entire household believed in the Lord, and many Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were baptized. And so there we see the birth and the beginnings of the Corinthian church, which is actually huge because, as you've heard us, we've referred to in this, from Corinth, we got the book of Romans. He writes First Thessalonians from Corinth. We start to see the beginning of the huge breakout into the Gentiles. A lot happened there.
We mentioned before the Roman road. There was a road that went around, and it went up this direction. And then Paul, remember we talked a session or two ago, and Paul branched off of it and went down into Greece. There's a Roman road that goes around the Mediterranean, okay? So if you traveled by land, a city on that road, everything spread along the road. If you traveled by sea across the Mediterranean someplace, you passed through Corinth because of that spot on that little isthmus. That's the one. So you travel across that spot. So if you traveled by boat across the Mediterranean someplace, all boats pass through Corinth. Yeah. And so if there was anything going on there, it spread every place around what was then the Roman world, the Mediterranean world. So,
All right. You want to pray us out today?
sure. Father, thank you for allowing Paul to establish a beachhead, so to speak, in the city of Corinth, and the training that he was able to do there, the things that he started, the fact that he began reaching out to the Gentiles in that place, which most of us hearing this podcast probably qualify under that category. Thank you that you reached out to us. And also thank you that you gave us ears to hear so that we would respond. And we thank you for all of that, Father. Help us to grow in the love of your word and the study of all of that. Thanks, Father. Amen.
Amen. See
All
you
right.
next time.
Next time.
Bye-bye.